Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 of Shannon Bell's Fast Feminism. This chapter is entitled The Female Phallus, Something to See. And in this chapter, we really see Bell's theory come to life, in which she looks at this embodied performance orientation towards gender and sexuality and looks at the female phallus. And you might be wondering, what is that? Even if you try to look it up online, you won't find anything. And it's a term that Bell is coming up with, but it has precedent in the medical community, just with different terms. And you can be warned, there is a lot of profanity and sexual language in this chapter, so if you don't like that, don't listen. But one of the things that Bell is doing in this chapter is she's looking at female ejaculation, which, is a niche in and of itself that's only gotten attention recently as various feminist movements have made female expression more normalized. Even going back to labor movements who were trying to get women working as something normalized. Now, Bell is coming along and she's talking about ejaculating on mirrors, for example, and this crazy, phenomenal sound that it has. And she writes on page 33 that it makes no difference. Butch, femme, somewhere in between, we all have the female phallus. And what is the female phallus? Well, the female phallus is the G-spot. But in particular, she's going to be looking at the development of the scientifico-medical understanding of the G-spot and talk about how, in fact, it is very morphologically, physiologically similar to the male phallus, precisely to show how gender, of course, is one of the ways to uphold power differentials. It's a way to obfuscate certain behaviors or forms of expression. And this can be grounded in a medical discourse, for example, that discourages certain acts using a pseudoscientific understanding. And for example, you'll know this if you know anything about race science, and you can see how race can be oriented in a pseudoscientific discourse in a way where it can uphold colonization, for example. So you can create a racial hierarchy and then use that racial hierarchy to justify certain levels of civility in certain places and therefore justify colonization. So when it comes to gender, Bell wants to look at expression of gender and sexuality and link it to physiology in a way that links us to an action we can't help but undergo, an identity we can't help but perform, and perform not in a derogatory way. This is a common misreading of performativity in Judith Butler's work. It's not something derogatory or something, that's just an appearance. No, it is something we are forced to be a part of, like when we orgasm, for example. So she writes, FF has an agenda to place female ejaculation firmly between women's two lips so that we are in control of ejaculation. We choose whether or not to ejaculate, and we squirt, gush, shoot, or trickle when and where we want. So, she's using all this language that's just like, it's unabashedly present and radical. But the point here is that the understanding of the phallus historically has been that is where the activity in sex lies. When it comes down to a sexual encounter, the man is the one who uses this phallic energy, which, this spills over into various mythoses and whatnot. This phallic energy needs to be centralized in the form of the male sex organ, which, because it protrudes outwards from the body and it shoots liquid. This is supposed to be somehow more indicative of the active role that men are supposed to have. Whereas Shannon Bell is going to be looking at the similarities and the body's interface with the environment, such that, as she says, female ejaculation is about marking the territory as the property of female ejaculators. So just like phallic imagery is used in mythology, for example, to mark off, oh, this is my territory by my tribe who is more masculine than your tribe, environment, be that sexual environment, be that academic environment, it is marked as the territory of an agent that is uniquely female insofar as, she's going to discuss the uniqueness of the female sexual experience. And going into the medical discourse of female sexuality is actually rather interesting, because she quotes Schubach, who says that there appears to be a process that goes on during sensual or sexual stimulation and excitement that affects the chemical composition of urine. And she responds, female ejaculation as a process that changes the chemical composition of urine? Like, when we just think about that link between a sexual process and these fluids that go through the body, it's really a quite magical process. And she mentions how it seems that raised blood pressure leads to a conversion of the properties of urea and creatinine into another type of fluid. Call it deurinized liquid. So basically there are these unique physical characteristics about female ejaculate that links sexual gratification to a fundamental change in the composition of the fluids of the body. And for Bell, this is very indicative of the necessarily embodied aspect of sexuality. Now, she mentions some interesting facets around the discourse of the popularization of female ejaculation, whether this is in sexology or in porn. And she mentions that the way it is usually portrayed, the G-spot, for example, is some sort of secret whose job it is for men to uncover in order to bring about the activity, in order to pleasure someone. And Bell wants to complicate this a little bit and break it out of this heterophallic assumption, as she calls it, whereby it's the men's job to activate something in women. Instead, she wants women themselves to be the ones actualizing this unique experience that defines what it means to be a woman, by saying, quote, female ejaculation isn't about comfort. It is not a maternal, soft, encompassing experience. It's raw, it's rough, and it's going right to the limit. Ejaculation is a biological function of the female body, and like its male counterpart, it is a body's right. So not only is it not the female's job to owe an orgasm to a man, no, she herself is owed an orgasm as the right of the female phallus. So by using the language of the phallus, because this is a historical kind of problem of, well, we have a term, the phallus, for the man, but we don't really have one of those for women. Especially considered that the female sexual system is typically seen as this dispersed, you've got the vagina and you've got the clitoris and you've got the urethra, for example, and it's all just kind of a heterogeneous system that's not quite unified in its activity like the very active image of the male phallus. But the G-spot, in fact, is quite interesting because the female phallus is this very present, it's described as a ridge, but in fact, as she says, it's shaped like a cock. It expands inside the body, it rigidifies, it responds to sexual stimulation, and it's made of the same tissue as the male prostate. So it had gone through various instantiations of, being called the female prostate, being called the urethral sponge. And she's like, no, let's take it out of this medical discourse that tries to give it some derogatory, derivative, secondary function, and instead make it the phallus that females actually have. Because one of the problems in discourse surrounding the phallus, for example with Lacan, is that females in Lacan's discourse are defined by not having the phallus. And she shows, well, they do have it. As she writes here on page 43, the question defining post-female sexuality concerns the existence of a female ejaculation and the female prostate. The ejaculating female body is the postmodern female body par excellence. It engages in a non-gender specific body action, makes the ontological categories of women and man obsolete, and allows female and male bio-body difference to blur into body sameness. So, with the demystification of the female process of ejaculation and unifying the female sexual biological system into, a complete locus of pleasurable activity, for example, the clitoris morphing into and going inside the vagina into the female phallus, this unifies into a sexual system that both men and women have. So it's no longer dimorphic, but rather it is a unitary possibility for non-gender specific body action, which allows us to focus on the bodily enactment of sex through affect, through feeling, through change, through becoming, through speed, instead of on an anatomical reduction to, the male phallus is just the most visibly present, but the female phallus is, as Bell says, quote unquote, not to be seen. And this insistence on the fleshy, bodily, indeed post-bodily, in terms of like cybernetics, aspect of sexuality is meant to blur the lines between, for example, male and female, or human and non-human, or man and nature. And she's pulling off of the work of Stelarc here, which I'll link some in the description, and I have some in the description of the lecture on chapter 1. But Stelarc plays on this a lot when he uses this sort of post-human aspect of art to go beyond bodily limits and blur the lines between what is the body and what is merely a happenstance connected to the body or enacted through the body or with the body. And she quotes here, "Flesh makes sexual differences melt into each other." So time, change, death, this is something unique to Bell because she continues to do her performance philosophy into the later years of her life. All of this provides gender categories with their necessary alterity and inertia. It gives them a history that changes across life such that, you respond physically to sexual responses differently across time. And, with things like menopause, for example, the sexual body is not this unitary phenomenon, but it's this constant process of alterity and change. And she responds to Halberstam, who observes, quote, "Bell represents gender as something that is necessarily fluid and as a series of acts," end quote. And Bell is trying to situate the sort of gender performativity, gender fluidity that Judith Butler, was so good at explaining. And Bell responds that is correct. However, Halberstam is wrong when he goes on to contend that FF simply hops between the two poles. Halberstam contends the very existence of transsexuals suggests that for many people, gender is far from fluid, and to represent its ideal state as fluid is to implicitly critique people who feel unable, for whatever reason, to hop back and forth between masculinity and femininity. And this is a very common critique of Butler, for example, is, well, saying gender is performative invalidates people such as transgendered persons who really do feel like they have some fundamental ideal sexuality that they need to return to, that they have had repressed through, societal implications and norms. And Bell responds, gender fluidity does not merely imply oscillating between male and female, but also being born biofemale and becoming male, or locating oneself somewhere along the continuum between normative masculinity and normative femininity, mixing the codes of femininity and masculinity on the same body. It could be the doing of excessive femininity or excessive masculinity for the sheer pleasure of the doing, or for the possibility of scoring the object of desire. It could be the doing of a hegemonic gender performance with awareness that this very doing is socially and culturally produced. So, masculinity and femininity for Bell isn't something that we're born with as a fleshed out form of social enunciation. It's something we must constantly contest and that constantly evolves. For example, with age for Bell is something that I like that she points out. We must act in a way to experiment with our bodies and thereafter find its area of comfortability. And this is something that even trans people are concerned with. Even once one transitions, you still have to situate yourself along this continuum between normative masculinity and femininity, as Bell points out. It's not like everyone who becomes trans, or, rather comes out as trans, I should say, that they suddenly just immediately become either stereotypical female-presenting person or stereotypically male-presenting person. No, they have to figure out, okay, I feel like I'm a male. At the very core of my being, I feel male. But that form of male, as it exists as social enunciation and as a feeling of comfortability, that itself is not stable. Even, for example, I, who am perfectly comfortable being, a cisgendered heterosexual man, even for myself, my situation of bodily comfortability in myself and in my modes of expression, they change over time. So even in positions that seem to have the least amount of alterity possible, they in fact are fluid over time. So just like for Deleuze and Guattari, for example, when they talk about becoming and deterritorialization, people commonly interpret this to mean that, we should get rid of all norms, all sense of identity, become a state of pure flux with no homeostasis of any kind. No, that's not what they're saying. In fact, when Deleuze and Guattari talk about deterritorialization, they say that this presupposes a territory to be deterritorialized, an identity to be deconstructed. So it's not that no identity exists, but that it is a molar formation consisting of a number of molecular flows making it what it is. And as such, it's a fluid concept, just as a river is a fluid concept. The way the water runs through the river gives the water a sense of uniformity. It twists through its environment across several miles. You can take an aerial picture of it and you'll get a relatively static looking form of the river. But as you zoom in and you go more towards the molecular level, more towards the micro level, you see more and more variation and alterity. So for Bell, gender and sexual identity is fluidity in a sea of flows complete with temporary homeostasis, but never a primordial self that you stop enacting, that you stop making. And I think this is one of the best quotes for understanding not only Bell's philosophy, but also Judith Butler's philosophy of performativity. This is on page 46. The body is simultaneously a biophysical given and a social construct. The term female phallus is used to refer to both the fleshy, spongy, biophysical penis equivalent and the social right to agency that in the past has only accompanied the male biophysical organ. So we have the given aspect of the body, of the self, of what it means to be me in my feeling of comfortability. This is like Heidegger's Dasein. It is my presence in the world that is a precondition for my understanding of the world. You know, it's similar to Descartes' cogito in a sense of the thinking thing, you know, the thing that is doing the phenomenological experiencing. So the given, you have not only my Dasein, but the world that situates my Dasein. And as such, my activities, what it means to be my Dasein at any one moment, is also constructed performatively by a world which is both, you know, natural, biological, and social in the form of rules and norms that we place upon each other. So there's an element of the given acting as a backdrop, but also an element of performativity that is the drift of gender and sex. Now, she mentions the development of the understanding of female ejaculation. And she says, well into the 18th century, what cultural historian Thomas Lacour terms the one-sex model was the predominant paradigm. In this model, male and female are seen as versions of one another, both anatomically in the sense that the vagina is an internal penis, and physiologically in the sense that the fluids in men and women are interchangeable. So, right, they're both producing fluids, they're both inverted versions of one another, and one is visible and one is more invisible, but they have, you know, they both have the potential for pleasure. But then she mentions the way the medical discourse has kind of built around this, and mentions, for example, Alexander Skene, who figures out that female fluids were linked with disease, the way he saw it. The Skene glands were kind of the primordial version of the female phallus, of the G-spot. And the Skene glands and the urethra for Skene became important as potential sites of venereal disease and infection, and not as loci of pleasure, as Bell says. So there's this insistence that somehow we have to find a secondary role for female eroticism, female pleasure, female anatomy, such that, you know, for example, Freud loves to put in like penis envy or some sort of secondary way in which females are beholden to the phallus as the active determination of their sexuality, which they don't have. And there's this, you know, object fixation that can occur if the female isn't able to cope with the fact that her mom doesn't have a penis. So all this sexism underlies and goes into the medical, and I medical with quotes because Freud can hardly be called a medical professional, in my opinion. That would be an insult to the medical profession. All of this theory going behind the medical perspective treats female sexuality, and specifically female ejaculation, as some sort of anomaly instead of something which is owed by right and which in fact is possessed by right. And we get to this point in 1950 where Ernst Gräfenberg discovers the G-spot. That's why it's called the G-spot after Greiffenberg. And Greiffenberg writes, an erotic zone always could be demonstrated on the anterior wall of the vagina along the course of the urethra. Analogous to the male urethra, the female urethra also seems to be surrounded by erectile tissue. In the course of sexual stimulation, the female urethra begins to enlarge and can be felt easily. So there are a lot of physiological similarities here between the male prostate and the female prostate, the male and female urethra, the fact of enlarging tissue, which was usually seen as just something that males have. So again, we're seeing that females very much do have a phallus. It just has been concealed as a sort of secret, such that only now are we discovering that it's something that women have by right and can use. And she mentions this project that she undertook where she has a clear speculum, this being Bell. She did this herself because, of course, she's a performance philosopher. Used a speculum and put it inside of her vagina, but it's a clear speculum, and turned it to the side after masturbating for a while, such that you can see the enlarged female phallus. And she writes here on page 57 that the visibility of the internal erection repositions the top wall of the vagina, specifically the spongy erectile tissue and the glands and ducts surrounding the urethra, as a female phallus. It turns out that the female phantom cock haunting psychoanalysis is an actual cock. Freud's little girl's so-called hallucinations were actually body knowledge of the presence of a real penis, always already there, awaiting the appropriate technology and action, a turned speculum, to come into view. Freud's little girl was Deleuze and Guattari's little girl all along. So what Bell is careful to point out here is that, for example, the way Freud sets up his discourse of sexuality, it is in such a way where female hysteria is linked to a boyish personality or a boyish disposition, and that boyish disposition being fundamentally active sexual characteristics. Wanting to take an active part in sex for Freud is seen as something that only boys are allowed to do. But this penis envy that Freud claims is because women can never have a penis, Bell in fact shows is the existence of an actual penis linked to an actual active female sexual possibility, sexual power that's latent there that has been covered up by this medical discourse, for example. And in terms of actually putting fast feminism into action here, she mentions how a sort of problematic part of sexual education surrounding female ejaculation occurred as internet videos were becoming more and more popular, but they were always in the discourses of sex therapists or porn makers or viewers, where it is typically a male audience which is trying to, grasp this information, and it was made commodifiable to a male audience. For example, in porn, where the female ejaculation is presented as some sort of hysterical spectacle, but there wasn't a lot of education aimed at teaching women themselves how to take control of their ejaculatory power. And so she mentions this very long, very detailed explanation of female ejaculation, and she says, these are directions that place a woman in control of her own ejaculation. They weren't written for sexologists, new age sex therapists, or porn makers and viewers, although they were published in a few porn magazines. So this is post-porn for Shannon Bell. It is a form of sexual information and explanation that isn't commodified into the discourse of porn, for example, as something that needs to be sellable. No, it's aimed at linking together being feminine with having feminine power and possibilities. And I really like how Bell incorporates Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy here, because there's this spot in A Thousand Plateaus on the little girl and the becoming molecular of the becoming one, or something like this. I've talked about it in a few of my lectures, in one of my lectures dedicated to A Thousand Plateaus, another on children and critical theory. And I think what's really important about Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy here is that, as we mentioned before, the appearance of stasis on the macro level is in fact the byproduct of a fundamental vitality on the micro level that Bell wants to take up in the form of sexual expression through ejaculation, for example. By altering these speeds and slownesses that Deleuze and Guattari love to talk about, these fits and starts, one makes their identity into their hands. Now, not just in their hands. It's not reduced to an action with no existence outside of that action. But no, you blur the lines of that identity which you presuppose before the action when you actually entertain that action. She writes here on page 69, Deleuze and Guattari's little girl had a cock. Deleuze and Guattari knew it. Their little girl is always in the process of becoming woman, but never solidified into a woman as a molar entity. That is, woman defined by her form, endowed with organs and functions, and assigned as a subject. Their little girl doesn't get contained in Freudian Oedipalization. She breaks on and breaks. That's not break as in like to shatter something, but break like to press the brake on a car. She breaks on becoming woman to erode both genders. Deleuze and Guattari's little girl, always from the beginning in the process of becoming phallic woman, has an organ that functions as a portal to the body without organs. It is precisely that which most defines or that which most reifies embodiment that can simultaneously de-stratify, de-unify, and de-hierarchize. So, right, this existence of the phallus, because it is now possessed by both male and females, vis sexual possibility, vis the possibility of ejaculation, now suddenly this hierarchized assumption of male sexual activity up here and then down below you have female sexual passivity with this strange secret of the possibility of pleasure of the clitoris or the G-spot. All of a sudden now it's something which is in the hands of agents which can break themselves down to a series of flows, of possibilities, of activities, of speeds, and build that up into a new form of expression. As she writes on page 70, FF had learned from de Beauvoir, a woman is not born, she is made. The making, the molarized interruption, the stoppage in the incessant process of girl becoming. The girl is defined by a relation of movement and rest, speed and slowness, by a combination of atoms and emission of particles. She's an abstract line or line of flight. And that quote, by the way, that's the one from A Thousand Plateaus I was talking about. She continues that Deleuze and Guattari understood the body more in terms of what it can do rather than what it can be. The physiological fact that male bodies and female bodies can both ejaculate and have physiological erectile tissues that can harden, solidify, and molarize into a phallus leaves the body a surface speed of having, that is, of doing, of activity. So, for Bell, an aggressive enough, radical enough, fast enough action can call into question the phallus and its presumed domination, vis an idealization, and rebuild it as an equal sexual encounter, an equal sexual possibility. as she writes on page 71, naming the internal female anatomy that becomes erect when stimulated and ejaculates copious fluid, the female phallus, operates as a re-territorialization of female sexual anatomy and a re-signification of both female and male sexual anatomy, eroding both and all genders to 1,000 tiny sexes. And that last part, once again, from Deleuze and Guattari. And this gets at what Bell has been trying to do in this entire book, and specifically this chapter, is that when we break down sexuality into a performance in terms of a process of something we have to embody and act through uncontrollable impulses, and I've purposely gone around a lot of the extremer language that she uses in this, both to keep it a surprise for you and because the video would get taken down. When we break the apparent staticness of sexuality and gender down into these 1,000 tiny sexes, that being the 1,000 tiny little ways we can use our bodies, we suddenly realize that both men and women have the possibility to be whatever gender they want, to craft their gender, to change their gender, to serve how they want to be in the world. So I hope this has been helpful in understanding Bell's work. There's lots of theory in here that can make it definitely very difficult. You've got lots of Freud, Deleuze, Bataille in here, just kind of lots of stuff that can make it difficult to understand. So hopefully this has been helpful. Check out my other lectures I've done on this work, on other postmodernists and critical theorists, German idealists, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom that you can tailor to your needs. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.